Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Okay, once again, this is Johnny on the Spot, science reporter for the Real News Network, and I'm here with the teenage super sleuths again. They've been looking into this global warming, and they're beginning to call it a hoax. And they were saying that they want to empower the student to be able to search for their own information to make sure they can get to the truth without having to listen to their teachers. They want to start the classroom rebellion now.
Confirm any data a teacher says,
That's
a parent,
right.
or even us. Confirm our data too.
You have to basically ask the right question. Now, Glacier National Park, they've been claiming the glacier there has been disappearing due to global warming, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Now, if that's in fact the case, wouldn't you want someone to show you data of Glacier National Park showing a great deal of warming in that area, right?
Yeah.
Well, look what happens when you go and look at the actual temperature data in Glacier National Park. Guess what? There's no warming, okay? So where in the world, and if there was warming, most of it was back in the 30s, which was actually the warmest decade that we have. So once again, if you're being told something is warming, use your brain, go check out the temperature data set from that weather station in Glacier National Park.
Yes.
That shows no warming. Now, you said you have some other interesting ones as well.
We have some other interesting.
Okay. You were pointing out that these are three different trends from NASA, and you're saying some things were very, very, very suspicious about this. As you can see, this is the 1981 Hansen chart. Once again, this comes from realclimatescience.com. That's Tony Heller's site. And as you can see, it clearly showed cooling between 40s and the late 70s. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then it started warming again. Okay, now this, as you can see, you had warming, and then cooling, and then it started warming again. Now, CO2 basically increases throughout, so clearly the cooling couldn't be caused by the warming. So there's nothing that happened here with CO2 that suddenly would have reversed temperatures. So right off the bat, you know something other than CO2 is causing the warming. Okay?
Exactly.
And then we have the 2001, and you said GISS is the the Goddard Institute of Space Studies, and you're saying so they've got a second, they adjusted it, but once again, what do you see going on? You see the distal, and you're saying this is distal and this is proximal. This means near and this is far away. What they did was they tended to drop the distal or the further away warming to show more of a linear and steeper trend in temperature. So what they're doing is they're pulling this type of data down. Then the most recent one, it's been pulled down even more. But what you said is real suspicious about it is this is linear. And you're saying that the absorption of long-wave radiation by CO2 shows a logarithmic decay, and that CO2 wouldn't show a linear relationship of increase with temperatures?
Yes.
You're showing that there's the law of diminishing returns that happens, and that as CO2 increases, the slope would actually decrease, but you're saying this, by the very fact that this retains a linear trend, which is very similar to the trend in CO2, shows you that this is sophistry, not real science, because the physics behind the CO2 molecule wouldn't support a linear trend in temperature.
Exactly.
And that's a lot of science jargon, but man, that's I don't have to take your word for it because, to be honest, I don't really know what you mean. But you're saying that the urban heat island effect is the major thing that's causing the global warming on the Earth measurements,
It's
right?
not the CO2, it's the global.
It's the urban heat island effect and a few other things you were telling me?
Yeah.
And you found two great examples. I can't pronounce this city, but you found two cities, one where there's urban development right here, and one where it's basically no urban development, right? This looks like a lush forest, and this looks like Buenos Aires, which it is. So this is La Estanzuela, okay? And so you can see that if you tear down the forest and build buildings, you'd expect this to get hotter than the temperature around it, but it has nothing to do with CO2, right?
Yeah.
And so sure enough, Buenos Aires shows a lot of warming, right?
Exactly.
But if you look at right across this lake, where there's no heat island effect, and you just take a look at what temperatures here, those temperatures have actually been falling.
Yeah.
So right there is a great example why you can't rely on ground measurements, right? And you said there's examples like this all over the place, right? Here is the West Point in New York City. The blue is West Point, and West Point is just a nice little forested area. That shows no warming, and I mean no warming, since 1820. But New York City has showed a decent amount of warming, and that's because of the cities, right? So once again, how can you rely on ground measurements? Because you know for a fact CO2 increased the same here at West Point as it did in New York City, but you have an upward trend in temperatures at New York City. How could that possibly be due to CO2?
It's not.
That sounds like sophistry to me, not science. So there's people in the classroom, start asking the right questions. How could that possibly be due to CO2? When you start pulling the curtain away and you look behind the curtain like in The Wizard of Oz, you realize this is all giant hoax, right? So this is the one that I found most interesting. I found this absolutely fascinating. This is the longest continuous track record of thermometer or instrumental data in the world. Is that right, Backflip?
Yes.
Right.
And so what you're telling me is you have a temperature measurement from an instrument, not an ice core, not a tree ring, not coral. Someone actually measured the temperature with an actual instrument going back to 1650. That's true?
That is correct.
And what you're telling me is if you look at just the instrument data in a consistent location, what you'll find is that there's no warming, even though CO2 has increased dramatically. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's
if you look at the data.
So what you're telling me here is let's just take a look at this annual temperature. Now this is Central England temperature, and you can look this up, right? Going back to 1650. And so as you can see, back in about 1680, temperatures were up around 10. Actually a little bit above 10. But temperatures seem to hover around, 9.5, 10. Okay, then we had a blip warming in the late 1700s, so you got up to about a little bit above 10. Then you're up around 10 again here in 1770. Then you got 10 here in 1820. Then you got 10.5 here in 1850. Then you got in 1920 you're up to about 10.5 again. Then in the 30s you're up at 10.5 again, and right now you're up at about 10.5 again. So what you're telling me is there's really no linear uptrend here. And even with all the urban development over this time period, you're not seeing much warming. But clearly, if you look at just the same type of temperature measurements over the long run, using instrumental data, increasing in CO2 has not increased the temperatures, right?
Yes.
Yep.
And look at the ranges here. I mean, this peak back in 1680 is higher than where we are today.
Yeah.
So I don't see any warming at all due to increase in CO2. Do you?
Nope.
Now, how in the world can you sit there and have this kind of data and reach the conclusion that CO2 and global warming is the cause?
It's completely a hoax.
Okay. Well, bottom line is, once again, start a classroom rebellion. This is called the Central England air temperature, and this is the longest continual track record of actual instrumental data. You don't have to make it up like some of the other data sets. This is actual data, and it shows no warming.
Also, don't be afraid to speak the truth, not simply obey.
In free societies, you must be able to speak the truth. And this is one that you thought was really pretty interesting because everyone's always afraid about losing the North Pole ice.
Yeah.
You're saying that they've got an actual picture of the USS Skate, made submarine history on 11 August 1958 when it became the first submarine to surface at the North Pole. Now that, to me, looks like a pretty ice-free North Pole, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how in the world, if the government knows that we've had an ice-free North Pole before, and it was much earlier in the century, why are they sitting there trying to scare you that the polar bears are going to disappear when we lose ice up there, when they already know that the polar bears have survived at times when there were no ice?
I don't see any ice around you.
No, I don't see it at all. I think that's kind of suspicious that they know that there's no ice up there, and yet they're making it sound like you're going to lose the polar bears. All right, well, that's that for that. That's you want people to look back because you have more exciting videos coming?
Yep, and we're going to take a deeper look at ice core data, and we're going to
you were saying we're going to go to the University of Chicago Mod Train to look at some really interesting calculations.
Yes.
Right? All right, well, we'll check back next, and we're going to show you even more ways to be empowered by science.
You see, the climate change alarmists are not just scientifically wrong and often scientifically illiterate. They are insane.